My name is Win Ki Ming, and welcome to this episode of the History Odyssey podcast. Tally ho ho ho. No, I'm not Santa Claus or Father Christmas or anything in between. I'm just your humble host, Steve, and a very Merry Christmas to all the listeners of this History Odyssey podcast. 'Tis the holiday season once again. I suspect that on this fine 25th of December, you will all be staying within the warm confines of your home, surrounded by family members and loved ones. Some, however, may not be able to afford this privilege as they are cruelly separated from their loved ones as a result of humanity's raging war against the coronavirus. Indeed, this great war has affected every aspect of human life. Even a holiday as sacred and long established as Christmas is vulnerable to alterations by this conflict. But Christmas was not cancelled. Not at all. And you can observe around you and see Christmas trees and decorations being erected literally everywhere possible. The spirit of Christmas has persevered once more. A similar state of affairs took place 107 years ago in 1914, though this time it was a war, a conflict, still strictly between humans and humans, not with a virus like 2021 and 2020. And in 1914, the nations of Europe were beginning their first year of what would become one of the bloodiest wars in human history, the First World War. But on Christmas Day of 1914, the first year of the war, something, one could say miraculous, happened as soldiers on opposing sides, enemies in warfare, laid down their arms, their guns and their weapons. Hostilities were ceased just for a few days, for a few moments, so that the spirit of Christmas can be preserved and this sacred holiday celebrated. Today, you will hear the story of the Christmas Truce of 1914. First of all, let us set the scene for today's story. You must understand what is going on here with all World War I, 1914 Christmas Truce. What does it all mean? So let's go from the beginning. So in 1914, Europe was in a very precarious situation. There were two main power blocks, quote unquote, alliances of nations at the time. There was the Central Powers led by Germany and Austria-Hungary in Central Europe, and the Entente, or the Triple Alliance, led by France and Russia. These were the two main power blocks who were constantly opposing each other and would go to war in 1914. And there were other European powers as well, such as the United Kingdom. They had an empire where the sun never sets, as the saying goes, and if I remember correctly, they control about 25% of the world population at the time. There was also the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, Turkey and the Balkans. They were declining, they were falling apart, they were losing territories, they were known as the sick man of Europe, etc. So the important thing is that all of these powers in Europe, all of these countries, were constantly competing and at odds with one another over control of certain regions or certain things. Germany and the United Kingdom were in a naval arms race. They were producing ships to see who could get the biggest navy and outdo the other side. France and Germany had an extremely tense relationship after France lost the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. In that war, they lost against Prussia and they lost the region of Alsace-Lorraine, or Alsace-Lothringen in German, and the Prussians occupied Paris, which was a really humiliating thing for the French. So ever since 1871, they really hated the Prussians, and as a result, Germany. Russia and Austria-Hungary were the main powers in Eastern Europe, and they were competing for control of the Balkans. The Balkans at the time was mostly controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but they were falling apart. So these new territories would go to new countries, and Austria-Hungary and Russia were trying to influence and dominate these new countries of Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Albania, Romania, and all those countries, etc. So I think you can see here, it was an intense and utterly confusing mess. And if war were to occur between any of these powers, say for example, if one power declare war on another power, then the dominoes would begin to fall, because other powers would join in to protect their respective allies. Say Power A declared war on Power B, then the allies of Power A would join in and the allies of Power B would join in. So you would create a really big war out of this, perhaps a great war. So this, at the time, Europe was called the European Powder Keg. Well, this European powder keg finally exploded in Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the fateful day of June 28, 1914. On this day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. Shortly thereafter, a complex series of events occurred. Again, this is a very complex conflict, so you could expect a lot of confusing things going on here. So a simplification of that, so that you can understand, is after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Remember, the assassin came from Serbia. They declared war on Serbia to avenge the Archduke's death. The Archduke was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the next person in line for the throne. After that, Russia joined in to protect Serbia because Serbia was Russia's ally. Because of this, Germany, who was Austria-Hungary's ally, joined in to protect Austria-Hungary against France. Germany also wanted to take land from France, so they joined in and declared war on France too. And because of this, they invaded Belgium. Now, they invaded Belgium because they had this thing called the Schlieffen Plan, which was a special plan to invade France through the nation of Belgium. But Belgium at the time was a neutral country. They weren't within the two power blocks of the Central Powers or the Triple Alliance, the Entente. So because Germany declared war on Belgium, Belgium was protected by, guess who? The United Kingdom. And because of this, the United Kingdom joined in the war. So at this point, you have Germany and Austria-Hungary against France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. And that is how the First World War began. Pretty confusing, huh? But I hope you understood this simplified version, oversimplified I'd say, of how the First World War began. Now let's actually get to something closer to the Christmas truce, the perception of war at the beginning of the Great War when it first started and before it. The people at the time had never seen anything like World War I. But remember, this is 1914, the war was just starting, so they have not experienced all the bloodshed and all the brutality and the horrors of the First World War. The Christmas of 1914 was only 5 months after the start of hostilities back in July. And I will say, these 5 months weren't at all peaceful. This period was known as the War of Maneuver. There was actually movement and the exchanging of territories. The Germans invaded Belgium and northern France during this time. Now, our current conception of the First World War is that it is of course a very bloody and brutal conflict. Wars are always bloody and brutal, and interestingly slow. And this is particularly important because we think that the soldiers in World War I fought in cramped and unhygienic trenches, and each time they pushed, attacked and advanced, they only managed to take about a mile or so of territory. Well, I'm not saying this wasn't the case, this is not a misconception. It was certainly the case during the middle and later stages of the war, but we're talking about the first 5 months of the war. And if you could put it that way, this was a relatively calm period of the war. The infamous and bloody battles of Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, with casualties up to hundreds of thousands in mere days and months, have not taken place during this time yet. So sure, there were casualties, there were deaths of course, but the war has not reached, if I may put it poetically, its nightmarish stage yet. So the people at the time were not yet exposed to the grim realities of modern warfare, with mechanized, motorized vehicles, chemical warfares that choke you to death. And people were more comfortable with war, if I may put it that way. And I don't deny that whether activist and pacifist, every conflict has those people who oppose war, but at the beginning of the Great War, World War I, people still held on to romantic notions of warfare. They believed it was a gentleman's war. They had a very rosy image of what warfare meant. They believed it was an honourable affair. This was especially true amongst the public school educated. I'll just remind you that public school here, especially in the United Kingdom, means private schools for the upper middle class. It's not like public schools in other countries. In Britain, it's called state schools. So just remember, public school here means rich schools, essentially. So this sentiment was especially true in the public school educated and male aristocratic class. They believed, war was a very fun affair. It was an honourable affair that every man has to go through. So you see, war was viewed as a gentlemanly activity. It was an honourable thing to be a part of. And most importantly, it was a patriotic duty. After all, would a right-thinking man refuse the chance to fight for king and country, or in Germany for Kaiser und Vaterland, or in France to reclaim the German-occupied region of Alsace-Lorraine? It was honourable, patriotic, and adventurous. And what could attract a young man more than that? So this sentiment is reflected in the recruitment drives at the outbreak of war. If you watched any footage from the time, you can see masses of people lining up and looking excited to enlist in the army. You don't see that nowadays, do you? You see people escaping the army, but not people lining up and filling in miles of streets to join in the army. In the United Kingdom, if I remember correctly, the recruitment age was 18 to 41, but there were accounts of 16, 17-year-olds and even 14-year-olds, that's my age, who lied their age into enlistment to join the army because they were so excited, and hear this, about going to war. Funnily enough, it was like they believed it was like a fun old hippity-hoppity tally-ho lads holiday adventure. It wasn't something to be afraid of, it was something exciting. That was what they believed war to be in the beginning. War wasn't scary at all. It was an exhilarating experience that every man should experience and get a taste of masculinity. So that would probably be what the young Tommy recruit would say to you at the beginning of a war. And it was exactly this attitude, this less than serious and jolly attitude to war, that contributed to the Christmas truce happening in the first place, instead of everyone just, shooting each other and disregarding the fact that it's the Christmas truce. So now that we have understood that the sentiment towards war at the beginning of World War I was very unserious and very jolly, positive, and affirmative. So now, enough context, let us get into the actual story of the Christmas truce. I know you've been waiting for this. Let's get into the actual story of our topic today. Alright, so we have gone through a lot of historical context, which is very, very interesting, but I hope you're still here, by the way. If you're still here, congratulations to you, and a second Merry Christmas in German this time, because of your dedication and effort with this podcast. Frohe Weihnachten. Now, let's get back to our story today, which is the 1914 Christmas truce. Now, one thing to note about this event is that it was quite a spontaneous affair. There weren't any official orders or plans or ceasefire agreements amongst the top brass of the war powers, and there wasn't any plans for this occasion. It occurred as a result of individual, quote-unquote, gentlemen's agreements, if one can put it that way, between individual trenches and regiments. This shows something really special, that this wasn't at all coordinated or planned. It came from the individual soldiers' heart and minds, not from some brigadier general in a headquarters miles away from the front. In fact, those kinds of people usually opposed the truce because they thought that it would lower morale. Anyhow, this really makes it special, as I said before. The soldiers, the boys at the front, remember most of these people were only 19 or 18 years old on both sides. Some of them were underaged, as I said before, 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds. even 14-year-olds who looked big enough to lie their way into joining the army. They all remembered that it was Christmas time, a sacred and special holiday, and a holiday that one should respect the spirit of. And they used that occasion to overcome the differences, hostilities and enmity that separates them, and to fraternize and unite in a noble brotherhood of man. Truly beautiful. Now, while I say this was an effort by the common soldiery, by the lowly soldier at the front, there were actually serious attempts at the top to end the war, end the entire war, not just for a few days but forever, altogether on this day. Most notably, we had Pope Benedict XV, who called for an official truce between the warring governments. He asked that the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang. Unfortunately, these efforts for a complete end to the conflict failed, but we can still appreciate the few days, weeks even, when the guns did fall silent and the men set aside their differences and hostilities and united in a brotherhood of man with the unifying and immortal spirit of Christmas. So, how did these truces occur individually in the trenches? Let's say, for example, imagine you're a British soldier in a trench in Belgium. How does the truce start in your trench sector? Well, there are many accounts about the initiation of the truces. An account from as early as the 1st of December a British soldier noted that there was a friendly visit from an enemy German sergeant. He came by and to quote, see how we were getting on. That sounds a lot more like mates visiting each other than enemy soldiers, huh? And also, the French and Germans, who were also at war, were less enthusiastic at first about this because their relationship was a lot more tense due to the different dynamic and the different reasons for war. The French really hated the Germans for taking Alsace-Lorraine, so the relationship between French and German regiments were more tense. But soon thereafter, these occurrences would take place between their regiments nonetheless. Now, initially, the truces weren't for fraternization, they weren't for soldiers meeting each other in a friendly manner. They were for something a bit more gloomy. They were for retrieving the dead. Now, we must know that this is still a war, and there are deaths in war. And because it was an active war zone, it was quite hard to retrieve dead bodies of fallen soldiers. So they used this occasion to retrieve their war dead and their fallen from no man's land. Now, I will explain no man's land to you as well, because will be referring to it a lot, and it plays a very important role in the story. No man's land is the tract of land, the space between the trenches. Now, the reason it was called no man's land is because no man would go there. If you go there, you'd get shot by machine gun fire, sniper fire, by shrapnel from artillery fire, or getting hit with a shell from a bomber up in the sky. So yeah, it was a very dangerous place, so nobody would go there, and that's where most of the dead bodies are. So during this occasion, they would hold burial ceremonies to retrieve the bodies and bury them. They would hold official joint funerals with Germans and British, and then joining funerals together. So yes, that was a gloomier start to the truce, but don't worry, it'll get a lot more fun. So another thing you must know is that the trenches were rather close in proximity. You can actually shout to the other side and they would hear you. Because of this, soldiers would shout greetings to one another. This was especially common amongst German and English soldiers, because before the war, many Germans worked in England. In fact, many Germans worked in London before the war. So they had a good understanding of the English language and culture. So they had a common language there to communicate with one another. A British soldier would record that he would hear Germans asking for news about football leagues, discussing the weather, talking about their girlfriends, etc. Just really banal conversations, like a bunch of mates chatting, and definitely not enemy soldiers in an active war. Anyhow, another interesting phenomenon that occurred was music. Yes, they actually sang there, in the more peaceful sectors, the sectors where there was less fighting. Let's just imagine you're in that sector. You would sit in your trench and you would hear the other side sing Christmas carols. with the explicit intention of attracting your enemy's attention and forcing them to sing also. So let's imagine you're that British soldier in a trench in Belgium, and you're just sitting there thinking about how you got here, and you would hear singing from the opposite trench, Stille Nacht, and you hear that singing about that's a familiar song, you might think. That's actually the song Silent Night. So you thought, why do these Germans sing and we don't sing? It's our song. Why did they get to sing it? So you start the singing amongst your trench, Silent Night, and it will go on like that. And yeah, it looks like a bunch of friends singing to each other instead of enemies, doesn't it? So it creates this sort of very friendly dynamic between the soldiers, and that's something that's truly beautiful. You think that these are actually soldiers who were looking out to kill each other, but in the end, they're still brothers in the brotherhood of man. And these friendly interactions would lead to more festive activities. According to Sir Edward Hulse of the Scots Guard, he wrote that they were planning a Christmas concert party. Remember, we are in a war zone, in the middle of a war. And he was planning this Christmas concert party to, quote, give the enemy every conceivable form of song in harmony. Truly magnificent and marvellous. And of course, one thing I must note, it can't be Christmas without Christmas trees. And Germany, after all, was the birthplace of the Christmas tree. So the Germans were the first ones who erected small miniature Christmas trees on their trenches and lit candles. So we can see the Christmas spirit has truly arrived at the trenches. Soonly thereafter, the soldiers would become a lot more bold, and there were excursions across no man's land. Remember, no man's land was a very dangerous place. In normal circumstances, nobody would cross it, but this was Christmas, and there are exceptions. So they would cross no man's land, the soldiers would climb out of their trenches and meet their supposed enemy face to face. Imagine you're still in that trench as a British soldier. You see your mates climbing out of the trenches, so you follow them out of curiosity, and now you're standing in no man's land, face to face with a German soldier. What would you most likely do? Well, what you likely do is actually pretty funny. During these fraternization periods, soldiers would exchange goods such as food, tobacco, alcohol. You would probably ask the German soldier for some German tobacco, and you would give them some British biscuits, for example. Or you're more curious, and you would ask for souvenirs. You would ask for his shirt button, or his hat, in exchange for something from your own side, maybe like a kettle, a teacup, something like that. Bruce Bairnsfather, who was a British Army captain, captured the situation rather well. Quote, "Dear Mother, I am writing from the trenches. It is 11 o'clock in the morning. Beside me is a coke fire. Opposite me a dugout, wet with straw in it. The ground is sloppy in the actual trench, but frozen elsewhere. In my mouth is a pipe presented by Princess Mary. In the pipe is tobacco. Of course, you say. But wait! In the pipe is German tobacco. Ha ha, you say, from a prisoner or found in a captured trench? Oh dear, no. From a German soldier. Yes, a live German soldier from his own trench. Yesterday, the British and Germans met and shook hands in the ground between the trenches and exchanged souvenirs and shook hands, yes, all day, Christmas Day, and as I write. Marvellous, isn't it? So you can see here, that was a very sobering experience. You're now face to face with your enemies, exchanging gifts. Yes, exchanging souvenirs, gifts, food and buttons, things like that. It is truly marvellous, as the captain describes. Aside from the exchanging of gifts, there is one iconic activity we must and will discuss, and I'll give you a hint. What happens when you put a group of Germans and Englishmen together and they fraternize? Football, of course. George Orwell once said that football was war minus the shooting. Well, in this case, it is truly war minus the shooting, because they are literally at war. In reality, while this is a truly iconic part of the Christmas truce, there isn't much evidence it was a common occurrence at all, which is understandable since it is rather hard to arrange a football field in the middle of a bloody war zone. And if it did occur, football matches were mostly played between regiments of the same country. But hey, we can imagine here, and there are still accounts of football matches between quote-unquote enemy countries, mostly between Germany and Britain, so we can imagine it being very exciting. Lieutenant Kurt Semisch from the 134th Saxon Infantry Regiment said that the English, quote, brought a soccer ball from their trenches, and pretty soon a lively game ensued. How marvellously wonderful, yet how strange it was. Remember, they were enemy soldiers ready to kill each other, and yet they were playing football together as if they're just people from different countries fraternizing like good mates. According to other stories, the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment pitched against Scottish troops, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders against unidentified German troops. According to the Scots, they reported to have won 4-1, but of course they would say they won. The Royal Field Artillery against Prussians and Hanovers, etc. So we can imagine the matches being very exciting because they are between Germans and Englishmen. And yes, perhaps it's even more exciting than, say, the World Cup. Anyhow, I believe this is a good place to end the story. With football, what a fun activity. So I think this was a rather interesting tale, innit? And this was often seen as one of the last iterations of a gentleman's war. Now, you might be wondering, did this repeat in the following years in 1915, 1916, all the way to 1918 at the end of World War I? Well, sadly, I will have to say this was a one-off occasion. It didn't repeat, at least not in the scale that was seen in 1914. Because if there is one sad reality about war, is that it hardens the soul of the soldiers. The soldiers no longer see war as a fun and tally-ho hip-hip adventure. It is a brutal and bloody thing to be in, a violent and deadly event. So it hardens the soul and it changes your perception towards the enemy. At the beginning, in the first 5 months, it wasn't actually that brutal, and most soldiers just thought that their enemies were just fellow man, fellow mates. Some of the German soldiers worked in England, so they had a connection there. But as the war progresses and it becomes deadlier with battles like Verdun and the Somme and Passchendaele with casualties of hundreds of thousands within days and months, things become very brutal, and your enemies don't seem that friendly anymore, do they? So that's why the friendly fraternization and the goodwill that happened in the Christmas Truce of 1914, it didn't repeat at all. And I think that's a sad thing. It shows how people really changed their perception towards war, as modern warfare truly shows its horrifying and horrific rear. People no longer think of war as something very romantic, something very rosy and worth joining in. It's a brutal thing, and I think that's a good thing, because that means that war won't happen as often as it did in the past. So you might be wondering still, after World War I, did this occur again? In World War II perhaps? Well, it did occur actually in very isolated and limited circumstances. Perhaps this makes for a good future podcast, so catch on to that. Now, I think this was a very interesting story, innit? A very interesting historical event that you've just learned. Perhaps you could share it with someone else, your friends, your mates. Perhaps you could share it with your family. I believe it makes for a great and awesome Christmas story and shows you to be a very intellectual and knowledgeable historian. Yes, you are now officially a historian. So thank you for spending your time with me, Steve, and the History Odyssey podcast today. And we hope to see you on our future episodes. So watch out whenever it comes. And since this is Christmas and we are talking about the Christmas truce, let me say Merry Christmas to you in the languages of the soldiers of the Western Front. Jus Noel, Frohe Weihnachten. And finally, Merry Christmas. Goodbye.
Have a holly jolly Christmas, it's the best time of the year. Now I don't know if there'll be snow, but have a cup of cheer. Have a holly jolly Christmas, and when you walk down the street, say hello to friends you know and everyone you meet. Oh, the mistletoe is hung where you can see. Somebody waits for you, kiss her once for me. Have a holly jolly Christmas, and in case you didn't hear, oh by golly, have a holly jolly Christmas this year. Mistletoe is hung where you can see. Somebody waits for you, kiss her once for me. Have a holly jolly Christmas, and in case you didn't hear, oh by golly, have a holly jolly Christmas this year.